Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. Dan, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, John. How are you doing?
No snow in Prague in your background today. That's a good sign.
No, it's rain, but actually this is a background, but it really is raining as well. It's pouring down right now, so it's quite accurate.
And we had snow today in Switzerland.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
oh, wow.
and the local mountains, it's been snowing. So there you go. It's always a little crazy, this weather.
Definitely.
Anyway, we've talked about AI intelligence a lot, Dan, but now today what we're going to get to talk about is this idea of gifted and talented. And I'm just wondering, what do you think when somebody says a child's gifted and talented? What are your thoughts? Because I don't really have anything concrete.
No, you know what's interesting? It's kind of an interesting thing because I was talking to New York City schools today. We're doing some work with them, and they're actually pulling back on their gifted and talented programs in some ways. So it's kind of interesting. So that's kind of an interesting thing for me. Or what are the reasons why some of these US districts are sort of stepping back a little bit from it? What are the trends? So they kind of that was my only kind of thought. Now it was interesting because for me, I think it's great. I think it's there's a bit of a program like that in my son's school. And I'm really interested in it, but like often, John, I'm kind of along for the ride and learning as we go.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me too, when I worked in LA Unified many years ago, we had a gifted and talented program. And actually, some of the charter schools were actually identified as gifted and talented schools, and kids would move from different districts or different neighborhoods depending on their scores, etc. And it was a very mechanical. And today, I feel very lucky because we have two experts on gifted and talented. And I think what is really important is so often we have misconceptions or we have ideas based on whatever points of reference we might have. But I think it's an important conversation because especially in international schools, we have such a wide spectrum. We have a neurodiverse population. And sometimes I think there's misconceptions or misunderstandings about that. And today we have Marian, who is a educator, but more importantly, has the organization called Bright Path. He's the founder of Bright Path, an enrichment and gifted education consultancy organization working with international schools, and they really work with closing the readiness gap and the distance between a child's potential and their capacity to act on it. He's worked with international schools across the globe. He's a father of 3 gifted children, so he's really in it every day. And before that, he was working in Africa, Asia, and Europe, involved in building teams in the business world. So, Marian, thank you so much for being on the International Schools Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John and Dan. Appreciate it.
And then we have Michael, Dr. Michael Cascianelli. He's the head of secondary years at the Diploma Programme at the International Baccalaureate, and a University Cambridge-trained researcher. And he actually co-authored a book called Understanding Giftedness, a guide for parents and educators. And he's also pioneered the first implementation of a school-wide enrichment model in Italy, translating Renzulli's scholarship into a bilingual international school context. And he does a lot of work with leaders and schools around the globe. And of course, through the IB, is involved in education. And Michael, a very warm welcome to you too today.
Thank you so much, John and Dan, for having us here.
So I'm going to kind of kick off, and maybe I'll let whoever wants to start. We can go back and forth. I think when many people hear the word gifted, they immediately think of high grades or a very smart child or a genius. But what does giftedness really mean? And do schools often get it wrong about what it is?
Marianne, may I go forth with this?
Yes, please.
John, thank you for the question. So I believe that what schools get wrong and what we as humans get wrong is that we love putting labels to things. And therefore, as Dan knows in international schooling, but even in schooling in general, when you have a student with diagnosed ADHD, autism spectrum, or even gifted as a label, it's great for teachers to understand, oh, that's the gifted child and that's the autism spectrum child. However, that creates such an elitist approach for educating children in that specific sense that exclude others. And so when we talk about inclusive education, we need to create systems that develop that approach rather than excluding others in that picture. So to be brief in responding to this question, rather than thinking of the label related to a child, we generally go into labeling behaviors that we see and that we can track over and over and over again. If a child, in a sense, is not connected to that label, then he will be able to monitor those behaviors and then work on it.
I think that's really interesting how you say that often we misunderstand, and this labeling is something that we're very quick to do. Even in an informal sense, when you see somebody on the street or somebody behaves, labels are our first kind of go-to. And I really like the idea that you're focusing on this idea of behaviors and looking into that. What are those behaviors? Marion, any thoughts on that idea that Michael shared?
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I didn't know I was gifted as a child, and I wouldn't have liked the label. I would have hated the label for several reasons. One is it would have put more pressure on me, and I was trying to relax throughout high school. And two, I had my own ideas about what giftedness was, and that's stuck with me. It's a chess player. It's someone who's studious, and I was a class clown and a sports kind of guy. So I wouldn't have appreciated the label anyway, and I would have probably pushed away from it. But if the gifted behaviors had been pointed out, some of the fear of failure, or wanting to avoid doing very difficult things that require sustained sort of action, sustained work, that could have definitely helped me out throughout school, and I see that with my kids too. So I agree with what Michael's saying, 100%.
And Marion, in your organization, you talk about this readiness gap, the gap between what a child's potential and their ability to act upon it. What does it look like in real life, like for a parent, a teacher, and even a student?
Yeah, John, that's a great question, and one that I think about a lot. Obviously, I thought about the readiness gap because I went through the IB program and I didn't feel I was ready for life after, to be honest. I didn't try particularly hard. I was able to get by and get decent grades. So when I got to university, I had very few skills in terms of, planning my day, organizing my work, like I said, the sustained sort of, attention to something. So I had a difficult time in my first year at university. I failed that. I had a very difficult time the second year because nothing changed, and I failed that again. Third year, I had a mentor and finally got over the hump and figured out how to do the things I needed to do. But I kind of had the same challenges in my working career. So I ran into some issues with, the same things I mentioned, and especially when I had a big piece of work to do, like a thesis, or at work, maybe a big financial model. I'd get stuck for days and days and days, and things would just look harder and feel harder, and I'd kind of go inward. And that's for me the readiness gap, and that's something that I feel like I have a lot of potential, but I didn't know really how to act on it. And I see that in my kids. I see that in kids at school. I see that in kids in my basketball team. I coach a youth basketball team, and it's the same thing. So for me, the readiness gap is exactly that. It's the difference between the potential someone has and their capacity to act on it. So it's not a gifted only thing or a gifted behavior only thing. It's not even a thing that you can never be ready. There isn't like a final destination in that sense, right? It's a process. So it's preparation, making sure you can take the opportunities you want in life. And I feel that's missing in my experience in some of the gifted behavior work. And it's was missing in my time, and it's still missing a little bit.
That's so interesting about this readiness gap. There's a gentleman called Frank J. Barrett who talks about the provocative competence, where often people see other people and they see the potential and they create this provocation to kind of heighten their competence. It's there, but maybe they're not aware of it or even know how to manage it or deal with it. So that readiness gap really resonates. Michael, in your own work, because you've worked at a systematic level, what do you, what are your thoughts on this readiness gap and the work that you've done actually school-wide?
Yeah, the work that Moraine is doing is just fabulous because it involves all the stakeholders in the picture. And what I found when I was sort of ahead in Italy or in China or even in New York, and I will tap into what Dan mentioned before about the New York schools, but the parent is the missing picture that we usually have, and Moraine's work is tapping into that. Usually schools, they do investigate the systems that are included in how to support students in the classroom, or how to support teachers teaching those students, but they never tap into what the parents actually perceive and to what they actually create. Some parents get into all sorts of delusions in, now I have a genius as a son or as a daughter, and then they create associations and then they go and get funding for that, but they forget that they have an individual who needs support inside the four walls of the home, and that's sad. And I think what Moraine is doing is actually tapping into that.
Now, you, Michael, when you look at this type of work, at a school-wide approach, why is gifted education not only about finding, the exceptional students, but about building a system that helps more students grow well? Because you're really trying not to isolate a few kids, I imagine.
Yeah, and I will tap into what Dan mentioned before in the US, and that's also related to the Schoolwide Enrichment Model from Joseph Renzulli. In the US, the methodology of acting upon the Schoolwide Model was the pull out of the students and putting them in a school that was just for the gifted. But if you think about it, that's quite an exceptional model to kind of separate from the system those who are actually behaving in a specific way or have specific attributes or specific skills. And why not integrating them into the society of the classroom and rather lifting all ships within the room rather than just a few? Why am I saying that? Not only quoting Joseph's work, but even to say, if we want to build any inclusiveness within our classrooms, we need to think individually at the skills of all the students that we have. Now, this is complex and it requires structures, it requires systems. Therefore, that's why the Schoolwide Enrichment Model has become quite popular. It provides that system that no others had provided before as researchers. Joseph was grand at doing that.
Yeah, and I think this idea of a system-wide approach, and I like the way you said, let's elevate everybody in the classroom. Why should it's almost like, why only the premium club members get to have that and everybody else doesn't? People often assume gifted children will succeed on their own. And I'm just curious, Marian, from your experience, what can go wrong when schools or families believe that? And that's a bit what Michael was saying. There's this idea of delusion. Oh, my kid's gifted. Let's go and give him violin. Let's make sure he only listens to Beethoven. And then suddenly this child is just, their day is booked fully.
Yeah, that is a really great question. I think there's a whole breadth of sort of experiences. I can speak again from my experience in that I looked like I was succeeding from the outside, right? So as a teenager, I was physically very active, playing a lot of basketball, going out a lot, having fun, kind of looked like I didn't have a care in the world, but I know inside, I didn't feel that same way. I felt sort of an unease or maybe a frustration or I guess underlying anger almost that would come out definitely in basketball, sometimes in more social settings. And as I grew older, so into my 20s and 30s, that lingered. And what was underneath that was, well, I felt like a failure. I felt like to the outside world, I had a pretty good job. I was living abroad. I had, a beautiful family. It looked great, but inside I felt unfulfilled. I felt like a failure, like I didn't take real risks, like I didn't put myself out there, like there was just a fear of, like I said, fear of failure, but also fear of success, so never really grasping onto anything too hard, but from the outside it looked like success because I didn't show that side. And I think with myself, where it led to basically depression at university and a burnout in my working career. But for kids, it can also look like that, disengagement. It can look like kids not wanting to go to school. In the Netherlands, there was some research. If you take the sort of common, I'm using air quotes for the ones on the Spotify or Apple, but if you look at the kind of common definition for giftedness, which is IQ of 130 or higher, that's about 2.5% of the population. And of children in the Netherlands that are not going to school, so that are sort of physically incapable or mentally incapable, not willing to go to school, it's between 25 and 40%.
Wow.
So 10 to 20x, the number of or percentage of gifted kids. So there's something that's happening on the inside that might not be visible on the outside until it's too late, if you don't pick up on those behaviors. So if you ask about can you leave gifted children or kids that show gifted behavior on their own, and they'll succeed? Yes, some, and some won't. And it looks like from the research, more often than not, they don't.
They don't.
So,
Yeah.
Michael?
Yeah. Interesting. Michael.
Yeah, as a follow-up, it is never enough. So the feelings that those students have in the classroom or even outside when they go and perform in a specific, band or whatever other activity, it's never enough to them. And once the parents, they understand that there is a gifted behavior into that, they, instead of supporting it, they push harder and harder and squeeze the boy or the girl to see to what extent they will be able to achieve in that sense. And this is, again, concerning at a system level, because when Moraine mentioned, 2.5%, 3%, we're talking globally of millions of students that impacted. We're not talking about peanuts here. We're talking about millions of students. So how do we support the system so that the system creates that kind of plethora of opportunities for students to thrive? And again, you can see lots of things happening in schools that are trying to do that. But again, much more resources will need to be given to those schools. It's not just about the pedagogical part, but even allocating specific resources for that.
Yep.
So what are some of the common signs that gifted learners not being well supported? I mean, is it like dispositions, boredom, frustration, or even behavior problems? What are some of the signs that you see and you're like, oh, okay, time out, we're not addressing this correctly?
Yeah, and I will argue, aren't those specific feelings that all students can feel, right? And as school leaders and working in schools groups as well, you see that many students, they do disengage, they do get bored. And so we should question ourselves saying, is it just for the gifted children that the students get bored, or rather for all the students in the classroom? And if that is the case, how can we kind of avoid that? I'm sure that we all remember moments in our classrooms 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever, many years ago, and we felt bored, or maybe we're not engaged. In the specific sort of instance of Moraine, as a gifted child in that sense, that might have been at different levels, but I think a great deal of boredom and frustration is also good for students to actually experience. The only parameter that we need to remember is to what degree is it okay to experience those feelings, or to what degree it's not okay. And when it's not okay, as a school, what do I do to avoid that students actually going into complete disengagement? And that happened to me when I was in school as a gifted learner. So there you go. In a way, disengagement can go bad and then eventually create issues.
Marion, for your own 3 children, have you experienced what Michael's been sharing, is that they're not being well supported, and then you've at home seen behaviors or conversations? I'm just curious, because you're surrounded every day by these children.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That's a good question. That actually started about 5 years ago, when my eldest was around 8, and we just come back to the Netherlands from living in Rwanda. And it's kind of a tumultuous time. and he was doing okay. He's doing fine at school, wasn't connecting as much with maybe other, wasn't really making a lot of friends. And we noticed that he started completely disengaging. So where he was this kind of fun, bubbly, curious, excited, like, you know, boy, he started becoming just kind of like a shell of himself, kind of turning this like big, you know, fire into just a little flame. And we started being a little, you know, concerned about that. And typically in the past, when that happened, I would just spend more time with him after school, and that would sort of, you know, work. But we had a conversation at school, and this was the end of 4th grade, and you know, they suggested that perhaps he's maybe on the autism spectrum. So the first thing you do here in the Netherlands is you take an IQ test, and you know, it was kind of very high. So his teacher, with my son sitting there and me, said, well, you know, his name, it's the end of 4th grade, you already speak 3 languages fluently, what more can we teach you? So he was literally being told, well, you know, you speak 3 languages because you have, you know, parents at home from different countries and you lived abroad. So what else can we do for you? He completely disengaged. And I started working with him the next week on after school projects. So my first thought was, oh, we have to teach him how to, you know, learn how to learn. We have to work on his executive functions. We're speaking with giftedness specialists. And I started working with him on programs after school. So he had a project that he really wanted to do, which is basically his question was, can you travel in time? Can you time travel? And we set up a project, and you know, it required planning, structuring, commitment. We made sure we did, you know, some reflection at the end of every session, and that was fantastic. But that was one side of it. You know, he told us, I don't want to be Einstein, I want to be Ronaldo. So it wasn't just about learning how to learn, but we did see that disengagement, and you know, I picked it up right away. And actually from that started my complete career switch into this field. So we saw it, we acted on it, and then we saw the same thing with our second born as well. And yeah, I do have to add one thing to that. So we have 2 boys and a girl, and the 2 boys, they you know, they had outward shown behavior that showed people, okay, there's something going on. But my daughter was a model student. You know, she does everything fine. She fits in socially in the class. She's polite. She's funny. She's active. But when she got home from school, you know, she would kind of, I hope she doesn't watch this at some point, but she would start shouting and yelling and getting frustrated very quickly. And she was completely different at home than at school. So if you had just kind of left those separate, if we had no idea about, hey, this is how gifted behavior can show up, we would have just thought, you know, there's nothing going on. And if, you know, if you asked her teacher, they would have said, yeah, there's nothing going on. But putting those 2 together kind of made us realize, well, maybe there's something here too. And turns out she's having the same kind of, yeah, I don't know, challenges. She is gifted like her brothers. Let's put it that way.
Interesting.
Yeah, so
and it's interesting, as you brought up, that, you know, your children speak different languages and have had multicultural experiences. Michael, because you work with international schools globally, you know, students come from many different cultures, languages, and learning backgrounds. How do you think in an international school context, especially when we have so many different kids coming from, excuse me, different education backgrounds, points of reference, how do schools make sure they don't miss gifted students who might not fit the usual picture? And we're generally, and I'm oversimplifying, most international schools are very Anglophone centric. So you are going to have kids with non-Anglophone centric backgrounds. And I'm just curious when you work with schools and your own research, what have you noticed?
Yeah, thank you, John. It is actually quite easy to misinterpret the signs of gifted behaviors or attributes, especially if the conduit of the vocal aspect of things is not there. Therefore, language acquisition is key. And whenever there are students who are new to a specific language, and I'm thinking globally, not only in Anglophone countries, but even, you know, if we go to China, if we go where I worked, or even to Japan, where Moraine was for years, those are tricky kind of situations where the language acquisition needs to intervene immediately. Otherwise, students might miss out. It happened to me a couple of times in my international schools where a student was not engaging, and we thought it was actually a language barrier, but then it was not only the language barrier. There were many other indicators there. The parents were getting frustrated. The teachers were like, oh, this child is not learning, but actually that child was showing gifted behaviors in other areas outside of school.
Oh, interesting.
And we didn't know anything about it. So there are solutions to that, which are related to engaging parents as much as possible. And I keep mentioning that. Why? Because of course in schools there is an unconscious bias that we know it all, because we have the students for 8 hours a day, but actually what happens for the other 8 hours at home, we do not know. And we make assumptions on how the parents educate their children. And that's quite concerning. It's kind of missing data in the data set, almost ignoring it. And I'm not saying that it's easy to engage parents. It's actually quite complex. But in this case, it's even more important.
Now, you talk about the parents, and so when both of you, when you engage with parents, what are the most common things that you have to have them unlearn? Because, of course, when you have a child and you assume they're gifted, there's excitement, and they're kind of, they're breaking away from the pack, so there maybe is potential. There might be thinking, they're thinking Einstein or whatever it might be. I'm just curious, how are you both working with parent and parent communities to kind of recalibrate and make sure that they understand? And Michael's point's an important one where, we understand kids within the 8 hours of school, but there's a whole life at home, and the parents very likely don't always understand what's happening at school. So I'm just curious, both of you, what are your kind of approaches and experiences with parents?
Maureen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion that you need a very different parenting style, or at least you need to change your parenting style. And the biggest difference is that you probably have all these expectations. First of all, when your kid is born, when they start going to school, you'd like for them to be around a group of friends. You want them to be sort of active and engaged. And you might, even if you don't know it, you have this sort of idea of where they go in life. And it probably mirrors a lot of your own life sometimes. And I think the first thing to let go of is that you kind of know how it's going to play out, because you don't. First of all, every child is unique, so maybe every parent has to learn this. But definitely in the parents that I've worked with, because I've done some coaching of parents and adult gifted, is unlearning that. So letting go of sort of this idea of how things are going to play out, and then understanding. I mean, it's hard to say this, but looking at your child through a different lens. So looking at your child and going, hey, try to let go of these like preconceived notions or these projections that you might have, and really look at what they're interested in, right? Like my second born is super interested in WWE wrestling. He's super into it, but normally I wasn't allowed to watch that as a kid, so I'm already happy for him. But he's interested in the storylines and how you make it up, and how there's telltale signs of who's going to win, who's going to lose, and how they book matches, and so he gets so into it. Whereas other parents, or perhaps, my wife might go, well, this is kind of ridiculous. It's not even a sport, right? So it's letting go of that. And I know that's not a perfect example, but it's letting go of that belief. Michael?
Yeah. So I'm always, whenever I speak to parents about this, I'm always starting from the double-edged sword kind of perspective. It can be a gift, and this gift needs to be nurtured, but there needs to be a great deal of connection with that child. There needs to be a great deal of connection with the school, and with all sorts of activities that will allow that student to flourish. And when parents think of flourishing as an approach to educating children, they think of high grades immediately. They think of success in university admission. Or, in Asia, it happened to me multiple times when I had parents of 5-year-olds asking, so where would that student go to university? They wanted to know, 15 years ahead where the student would go. So I think reconnecting parents to the living part of their being parents and the living part of their having children. I think it's key, but we are fighting against the current because, of course, we have phones, we have all sorts of different distractions, we have social media, and that disconnection is becoming wider and wider, not only for gifted behaviors and gifted children in general, but for all children globally. So we need to look after them.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Sorry, Joe. I was going to ask, interesting, just an aside of what Mariah was saying. I was thinking as he was talking about myself as a parent, about how it's not getting your children to do the things you want to do and letting them have free rein. Because I've been guilty about that. And I think if most people are honest as a parent, they have as well. I mean, just one example, you mentioned basketball. I mean, I always played rugby. My dad played rugby. My granddad did. And then I got my son into rugby, and he likes it, I think. I mean, he's playing in the Czech Championship this weekend. But I didn't start from the position of all the sports and activities in the world, what things should we try out? I said, why don't you try rugby? It's going to be good fun. I like it, And, because it's brought me a lot. I've played around the world. I've got lifelong friends and things. But it is hard as a parent to really step back and look at the child and say, what do they want to do? What can help them develop? It's an interesting point. I was just thinking as you were saying it.
I think that's really true. I think as a parent, we often, you see a kid, an interest, and then you're like, okay, we're going to invest all our time. They're interested in that. Yeah. And it's a passing phase because they're 7, 8 and they're interested. And then at 10, 13, then they're into something else. Yeah. So I think that's really important. Do you ever, we've been talking about parents not sometimes being able to let go and let that gifted child flourish. Do you also have the case where parents think their kid's gifted and there are false signs, or there's a misconception of what gifted, and then you have to bring them down? Because I assume usually when the label gifted, and we understand labels are not the way to go, but there's this kind of excitement, and maybe they start internalizing as their own journey. I'm wondering, have you had to tell parents, sorry, bad news for you, your child is amazing, wonderful, very bright, but they're not gifted?
John, I think you're talking about 50% of the parents of international schools who think their kids are gifted, based on my cohort of my kids.
You nailed it.
No, I know, but I was just hoping more of an academic response.
There is definitely that picture from a lived experience in international schools, as Dan mentioned. Once you start investing cash into the life of a child, you start picturing all sorts of different scenarios that might be useful for you as a parent for the return on investment. It's human. I'm not saying that parents who do that, they are mean or anything, but it's unconscious that parents, once they start investing time, energies, kind of assets, then of course they expect that flower is blooming one day or the other. So why are we saying that? Because of course it happens multiple times, especially when you have kind of a process of not diagnosing, but rather discovery and exploring, who you will need to support in the classroom. And there is a moment when it comes to that child needs more support because he's showing gifted behaviors, and that child might not need that support. That's when you have the parents of the person who does not need support, who wants that support for that child who's not showing any signs of giftedness. And that becomes tricky because that unconscious bias of gifted as genius, genius as great, and great as success, it's not easy to remove. But that's why the work of heads, the work of teachers, the work of psychologists inside the schools are critical in allowing parents to actually relax a little and reconnect with the lives of children.
And I think that word that you say, letting them relax, because I think, Dan, what you're saying is, many international parents are successful. They're of a certain socioeconomic group. So there is expectations. I mean, most international parents very likely are not hoping their child ends up being a plumber or carpenter, which I think is a great, actually, nowadays, that is a really good...
Nowadays, you'll make more than a graduate.
You will make more than a graduate in business. And it's really a career that requires multiple skills and organization and cognitively quite complex. But I think people come into this narrative very much with this predisposition. And one thing both of you have been talking about, and Marion, in your own anecdote, is, how, you talk about how you're very supportive, understanding the challenges and how important it is to be caring. But how do you help gifted students grow not only in the performance and identifying that, but more importantly, because you talked about this idea of resilience, confidence, and self-understanding, where they can kind of understand and come to terms with those feelings. You talked about failure, and because I think what's really important is, the kids are hearing from the teachers and the parents, and of course they get influenced, but what can we do to kind of give them the tools to independently come to terms with that and say, okay, I'm feeling confident, I'm a little more self-assured?
Moraine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, like that's a process, right? There's no finish line on that, but I think there's a few things that I want to highlight. One is, it's more than just being a teacher or being a parent, being a sports coach or whatever. It's being a mentor, being someone who can observe without judgment. I know from my experience, and I go back to basketball a lot because basketball taught me a lot. I had a coach who was also my computer science teacher at one of my schools, and I remember for some reason he was non-judgmental when I did made a mistake or did something stupid or acted silly, and it was more guiding and correcting and letting me learn, not by being told off, but just by nudging. And I think for me that was huge, because I know in my experience I saw teachers as sort of different from us, right? They're teachers, we're students, and I think that humanized it a bit. I definitely try to do that in the class. So I teach an enrichment class, which is a pull-out class. I do the same, and it's a bit of a challenge because these kids have been seeing me as a parent on the playground, and now they have me as a teacher. So it takes a while, but it's being that taking on that role of guide or mentor and letting them figure it out themselves, letting them hit the wall, letting them make mistakes. And that's quite a hard thing to encourage to someone who doesn't perhaps want to make mistakes or hasn't really been comfortable making mistakes. It's showing by doing. So also showing that you're vulnerable, that you can make mistakes, that you're, human in essence, and learning from that and reflecting on it. Because, I think all kids have a very good capacity to reflect if you give them the right kind of space to do so. And ask them the right questions, they'll always surprise you with what their answers are. So I think those are some of the main things for me that are important. And I think I want to add to that I have a unique perspective on it, because I also coach youth basketball, like I said, and in my neighborhood. And so I teach at this Dutch public school about one day a week in the same area, and then I have my kids at home. But probably 3 or 4 of the kids in my basketball team are from the enrichment class as well. And we were just talking about it yesterday. Half of the team has skipped a grade. So somehow basketball is pulling in these kids, or it's just a super coincidence. But it allows me to use some of the stuff that they learn there on the court and transfer it to the other domain of academics, or maybe at home. And I see the parents more often, so I can engage with them there and I can engage with them at school. And I think that's an opportunity that so many international schools might have, where sports, extracurricular activities, these things are taking place at or within school grounds. There can be sort of communication between staff. And if you combine that with working with parents, working more closely with parents, especially with kids that show gifted behaviors, I think you can provide a very strong foundation for kids to work through that on their own together, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one word that you really brought up that's interesting at the beginning is this idea of judgment, because you have to let go of that judgment. Michael, you've been a head of school in many different contexts. How do you get teachers to, because you get your class roster and you look at the kids and you immediately, we all do this, we label people, right? That's just and then you kind of categorize them. What have you seen and done, or in a systems way, to make sure that judgment doesn't get in the way of maybe letting it being more open-ended?
Yeah, I will have a little quote here. The bright path to education is through self-regulation and self-management. Why am I saying that? Because if we think of teachers in the classroom, the first skills that they need to implement with their students, for themselves and for the learners, is how do the students self-regulate? How do they self-manage when they are 5, when they are 15, when they are 18, or even at university level? And especially for students who show gifted behaviors or attributes, that becomes even more important. And even mentioning on what that judgment part that we mentioned before, that happens, that self-regulation happens whenever there is an element of trust amongst all the stakeholders. And that comes with that duty of care that we need to provide. But that's usually seen from the lenses of safeguarding, of allowing students to feel safe within an educational context, but never through the lenses of how safe am I feeling from the judgment of others, including my teachers. And that goes into assessment of learning that should not be like that, but should be assessment for learning. And I'm saying it with a grain of salt there, just because we keep thinking of assessment as an indicator to say how good that student is. But if we see it as a step to get more knowledge into a specific area, and we're going back to Vygotsky, 1978, I believe, that idea of scaffolding, that needs to be there. Otherwise, students will feel labeled, they will disengage, and they will not do anything, because why should I do that if you will judge me and will feel that I'm not doing my job? And this, unfortunately, has been a recurring theme over the years and over generations. It didn't start last year or 2 years ago. It started 150 years ago. And that still needs to be solved. So we have quite a responsibility there.
I think it's really important what you said, assessment for learning and not assessment of learning, because I think that in itself, if you do that shift, I think very likely then it's a different type of judgment, and you're very likely moving forward in a far more collaborative and thinking about the student at first, more than just making sure your grades look good for whatever who's ever judging you. There are kids that are gifted, but there are kids in classrooms that aren't. How does one juggle so there is not this feeling like, oh, he's gifted and I'm not, and then suddenly there is this feeling of haves and have-nots? Because there's no doubt, however non-judgmental we are in our humanity and in the busyness of a classroom day, we are going to sometimes say things that maybe not intentionally, but maybe then the subconscious or the subliminal message or the subtext might give kids a feeling like, okay, now we're kind of separating the pack into different categories. How do you kind of balance that to make sure that everybody understands if you're not gifted doesn't mean that you're stupid?
Yeah, I will tap into this. I think that the main duty of a teacher in juggling with all these things together, having so many different students, up to 25 or 30 students in a classroom, at the end of the day is creating a space for dialogue, where students, that care that we were talking about comes through speaking to one another in a very caring way. And that happens when, even pedagogically, you're not bombarded with content, frontal teaching, where the teacher is in front of the whole class for 5 hours and the students, they need to listen and learn from the teacher. So I think that the real shift pedagogically might come even through kind of dismembering that content-led, especially in primary years, where you have a more thematic approach to education, and the IB does a lot with that. I'm not advertising here, no need there, but at the same time, I think that thematic approach to education solves a lot of issues. That project-based learning that happens in the classroom allows everyone to collaborate to a specific project, not because they need to get an 8 or a 9 or a 10 in a specific assessment, but because they are part of the same journey. And I think that suppresses a lot of the nonsense that even teachers and schools create.
I think that's a really good way of sharing this idea of the process. Everybody gets to be part of the design thinking process, and different people are going to go in different ways and uncover different things. And I think that definitely equals it in the sense, because when you're focused on knowledge and content, you either get it or you don't, right? You get a good grade. And I remember in the Swiss school system that I was, it was all about grades. A report card was 1 page with grades, and if they were bad, they were in red. And so I do think, and I'm going to promote the PYP inquiry because that's something that I think is very powerful. And some of the things that the IB do, this idea of inquiry, okay, maybe less in the upper grades, but I really like the way you highlight that as this process where people can all engage in their own unique way in different ways. And the process is what's more important. Marion, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I definitely couldn't have said it any better than Michael, and you just did. Trying to think yeah, I don't think there's any point in adding anything to that.
Okay. Yeah. So if schools want to do this better, because I'm sure people are listening, and even in organizations, because very likely this doesn't only happen in a school setting. You can be in a professional context. And Marion, you work in a professional context in the sense of a non-education setting. What's the first shift people have to make, be it an organization or school? What's the first thing you think would be, if as people listen and they're going, okay, we need to do something different? What would be your first shift? Yeah. Michael?
Yeah, the first one would be definitely creating a committee within the school that investigates these aspects on how to promote gifted behaviors, across all ranges of students' ages. And why that? Because not only that supports a mentality of gifted behaviors, but rather it gives, why are we doing this? Is it just for an elite, or are we doing it for all students in the classroom? And what kind of activities do we put in place? The committee decides, and they understand the picture. They even do some research within the school. You involve parents, student bodies, teachers, leaders within the school, and you do something tangible that, I don't know, every quarter you disclose information on what was done, what was not done, what could be investigated further. And that's a very tangible approach to create a school culture that supports gifted behaviors. From that, then everyone will enjoy the process, not only the gifted students in the classroom, but even the parents, understanding that actually, it provides some challenges to all students, but also the students who might not flourish all the time, and to provide the access approach to things.
Nice. Marion?
Yeah, agreed. Making it explicit. That's the first one, is making it explicit. So if you have a school where maybe, some kids that are gifted are being sort of, I've seen this at a school where kids that are gifted and want some extra challenge, or that show gifted behavior rather, are put in the hallway with an iPad with some extra math. So not different math, not harder math, just extra math. And making that explicit and going, okay, what's really going on? How can we really support this child? And not just ad hoc, or once, or just one teacher, more aligned across the school. So how do you do that? Yeah, you can start with a committee, and you can first start by taking stock of what's happening right now and what is working. Because I think the one thing that's overlooked when we're talking about this is that there's definitely stuff that's working already, and there are definitely teachers that are keyed into this and are really sort of understanding and trying to work on how to support these children, and doing what they can with what they have. So taking stock of that and understanding, right, what can we do tomorrow in our school? What can we do today in our school that could make a slight difference? And if that's starting a committee, or engaging with other teachers about it, or starting to try to get alignment with maybe the extracurricular after school activities, that's a sort of non-invasive way to begin looking at this.
Nice. Both of you have been kind of talking about the shift in what you can do and the process and being explicit and having this kind of whole child approach. What, from all the work that you both have been doing, what is the thing now, if you had a school leader in the room here or our audience, please don't do this. What would be one thing you would really invite people to be courageous or brave and really make an effort not to do something?
Yeah, as far as I see it, John, it goes back to the judgment part. And if we go and kind of underline the same biases that we have against, in this case, it's an against gifted learners, then, we'll create the same issues. And then we'll go into expectations that are unreachable. We will go into all sorts of different issues. So the first thing to avoid is going into the same biases, the same perceptions that are not actually true. When Moraine talks about the idea of perfectionism, not all the children, they experience that. Not all gifted children experience that, and even the non-gifted children, if we want to use that term, they can experience perfectionism. So the reality is, as humans, we tend to standardize as much as possible the kind of pictures that are in front of us, but we're all very different, and out of family upbringing, out of context, out of our own individual issues that we've had. So it's avoiding that would already be a great effort to do.
Marion.
Yeah, that's what happens when Michael goes first. I tend to agree with him. Yeah,
you can disagree with him.
You disagree.
I just don't. It is that. It is the labeling. It's funny, just a silly anecdote, but I spent way too long tinkering on things that I'm not, is it perfectionism? Is it just not wanting to put something out into the world? But the one thing that I didn't really tinker a lot on is the name of my company, Bright Path. And, I thought a lot about, do I call it gifted? Do I call it gifted behavior? Is it high ability? I didn't want it to sound sort of elitist or like something I didn't want to be associated with, and that's very hard. So that goes to say, like, I have these labels in my head as well,
yeah.
And they are, you have a label, and then your mind automatically goes, okay, that's that. And because I never associated myself with giftedness, I don't, my kids are gifted. That's a trait that they have, right? They show gifted behavior, but that's not who defines them. And what defines them, rather. So, my kids are funny. They play sports. They like to go on adventures. They're curious. They get mad. They don't want to do the dishes. They go to bed late. Like, there's so much to them. And if you work from that position of labels and saying, well, do we need a gifted program? These kids are smart. They'll solve it on their own. Then you're kind of falling into the same trap that people have been falling into for a long time.
I think both of you have just done such a really thoughtful way of reminding us that these judgments, even for non-gifted kids, are really what causes some of the issues, and that what makes schooling sometimes quite challenging. You started with your anecdotes of your own schooling, Marion, but I really appreciate, Michael, also you saying that if we can't judge and just look at a whole class approach, and that we're really looking at a system that impacts everybody, and yes, there will be some gifted kids and there won't be some kids not as gifted, but everybody is going to have this kind of very caring, kind of differentiated approach. And I think that's super powerful. And this idea of judgment, being able to let go of those judgments, which is super hard. So we're coming to the end of our podcast, and I'm just wondering if you each just have something you want our audience to take home as they think, wherever they're driving, walking, or in a living room, or wherever they might be, just something to reflect upon as they think of this topic of, I like the idea of kids going on a bright path. I do like that word. I think it's just much better than the word gifted, because automatically it comes up with judgment. So I'll leave it to each of you, just, something that you want people to think about as we wrap up today.
Moraine?
There's a quote that immediately came to mind when you asked that, and it's something that I remember reading it 2018, and it's paraphrased basically this: Some people go to their grave with music inside of them unplayed, right? And when I think about the work I'm doing, I don't really, I try to keep that in mind, because that's the feeling that I had for so long in my life, that I had this music inside me that I wanted to play and I didn't know how. And that feeling of frustration, despair, sadness, a life wasted. And again, I'm a happy person. I have a good life, right? I'm not complaining about that, but I'm explaining that that heaviness is felt. And I know that heaviness is felt by others. I know that heaviness can be felt by kids, because they do feel intensely. And if you keep that in mind when thinking about, should we do a gifted program? It's like, it's a no-brainer, because you don't want others to feel that. You don't want others to experience that. And whether they show gifted behavior or not, I think that's a motto we can all sort of ascribe to.
Love that quote. That's wonderful. Thank you. Michael.
And finally, I'm thinking of myself in the classroom, but also as a parent with my children. When we see a child, and for the audience, if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're an educator, when you see your children or a student who needs support, try to reflect on what kind of seed will you be able to put today that will change the life of that child. And if we were able to plant one seed a day, that would just be awesome for the life of that child that will remember forever. I know many students who were changed completely from an educator or from a parent or from a grandfather or a grandmother, and they remembered that seed forever, and that became a flower, became a tree, became a huge plant that now is an example even for others. And I think that reassures me in the positivity that humanity can actually bring.
Thank you for that. And I'm just going to read Marian's quote, because most of us go to our graves with our music still inside us, unplayed. And what a wonderful way to wrap up this conversation. Both of you, thank you so much. I know how busy you are, and we so appreciate the time. I want to remind that Michael has a book out. It's Understanding Giftedness, a guide for parents and educators, and the link is in the show notes. And of course, there is Bright Path, Marian's organization, and you have that also in the links. And both Michael and Marian are on LinkedIn, and I'm sure you're more than welcome to reach out to them and ask them for more. It's been a real privilege and honor to have both of you on the podcast today. Thank you both. And to our audience, thank you again. We're getting a lot of traffic. Thank you for all of those who keep joining our LinkedIn group that just gets bigger. And we really appreciate the comments and the feedback and people saying, I heard this and this. And so we really appreciate kind of the interactivity that you bring to our platform and to LinkedIn and to the podcast. And if you like conversations like we just had today, which were rich and really authentic, then make sure to go to whatever podcast you like and just put a little review and a little like. And then that way we make sure we can get more guests like Michael and Marian over. Both of you, thank you so much. And thank you for being with us. And to our audience, we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much, John and Marian.
And Dan.
Take care. And Dan, of course. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.